Chapter 7 of Travels and Adventures of an Orchid Hunter by Albert Millican. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Canoe Life on the Lebrija. The river Lebrija is the finest river draining the state of Santander, a tributary of the Magdalena, rising in what is called La Mesa de Juan Rodriguez, in the eastern Andes, at a height of about 9,000 feet above the level of the sea, passing the town of Piedecuesta on the northeast side, and running through the old Spanish town of Huron, following the department of Soto in the state of Santander, and emptying itself into the Magdalena at a place called Bodega Central, a small boat station of comparatively recent construction. Perhaps there is no better means of getting a good experience of what canoe life really is than by taking a journey on this river. Going up, there are the long, weary days with a burning sun and cramped privation, dragging the canoe over the rocky shallows. And in descending, there are the fearful rapids and whirlpools, where many of the canoes, with their freight and passengers, are lost every year. Thousands of bags of coffee are annually brought down from the interior on this river, and a corresponding number of bales of manufactured goods are carried up. The town of Bucaramanga contains about 50,000 inhabitants, and every one of these who would make a journey to the coast, however distinguished or delicate, from the polished Spanish lady to the hardiest Indian, must submit to a 6 days' imprisonment in one of these miserable craft on the river Lebrija, or another branch river called the Sogamoso, where the circumstances are pretty much the same, the only way to this large interior town being by way of these rivers, with the alternative of the overland route, which is 100 miles tramp through the forest, with men bearing provisions. When I made the ascent of the Lebrija, I left the Magdalena steamboat at Bodega Central, which is largely owned by two estimable merchants, Messrs. Lopez and Navarro, and is remarkable for the immense thatched warehouses crowded with piles of bags of coffee, hides, gutta percha, cocoa, plants, and various other products of the magnificent state of Santander, one of the richest, most important, and most progressive states in the Republic of Colombia. Messrs. Lopez and Navarro, besides owning most of the canoes on the river, also have several small steam launches, which ply on the Lebrija to a place called Estacion Santander. I took passage as far as the steamboat went, and we left Bodega Central at 4 a.m. in the little launch called La Primera. We steamed across the Magdalena and entered the mouth of the Lebrija, daylight coming about 5:30, and with it a sight of more natural beauty than I had seen before. I greatly enjoyed the wild magnificence of the forest, and the enormous timber trees festooned with such a profusion of gorgeous flowering creepers, supplemented by thickets of graceful palms and bamboos. The banks of the river are intersected at intervals by small streams, which drain the adjoining forest and sluggishly empty themselves into the main river. At each of these outlets a sight presents itself which would enchant the most stoical naturalist. Several huge alligators lounge lazily in the soft mud. As far as the eye can reach up the creek, crowds of ducks are actually huddled together, each one brushing his neighbour to get fishing room. The principal species is called by the Colombians El Pato Real, or royal duck, a wild muscovy, weighing sometimes from 8 to 10 pounds. Colour, a greenish black with white patches on the wings. Another, which is called in Spanish Pato de Aguja, is one of the divers, having the body black and the long neck covered with a peculiar ashy coloured down, the long snake-like neck tapering to the fineness of a penknife at the end of the beak. I shot some of both species, and they proved excellent food. The low bushes trailing in the water of the stream are literally white with small cranes, wistfully waiting for some careless fish, while the tall trees are bristling with large cranes of various classes. The osprey or fishing eagle and kingfishers complete the collection. I would gladly have secured a photograph of so interesting a sight, but as the little steamboat arrived opposite to them they invariably rose like a cloud, and after wheeling around in the air several times, alighted a few yards off to wait until the disturbance was past. The streams above mentioned run into the Lebrija at intervals, and as we passed each one, all on board seemed carried away with a desire to possess some specimen of these myriads of beautiful waterfowl. Many large trunks of trees torn from the banks and brought down the river by floods made the navigation very difficult, as we experienced when, about midday, our little boat ran foul of an enormous log, and it was only after 2 hours' work with axes and bars that we were at liberty to proceed. Besides this, there is the delay occasioned by taking on wood for the engines. However, eventually we arrived at Estacion Santander, something like 60 miles, in about 10 hours. The appearance of the village is not very prepossessing, the houses being of the most miserable construction, made of stems of the wild cane, bound together with creepers, like huge bird cages, thatched with palm leaves. These huts are almost entirely occupied by native boatmen, or, as they are called in Spanish, bogas. Occasionally these sheds are made extra long and divided into compartments by a lattice work of wild cane, each division containing at least one family. The situation is even worse than the village, being the edge of an extensive swamp covered with rank grass, in many parts intersected with pools of stagnant water, and in the rainy season being entirely flooded. Here the night dews are very heavy, and the air is continually charged with miasma, making it almost impossible for any European to live long in such a climate, the heat being also unbearable and the mosquitoes legion. This is the principal station for canoes on the river, and they are tied up to the bank in great numbers, from the most primitive hollow tree that will hold 2 men with difficulty, to the clumsy construction which carries 50 bags of coffee and 6 men. Something like 200 native boatmen live in the huts of this station. They are of the coarsest negro type, and about as low a form of civilization as it is possible to find, excepting a tribe of wild Indians. They are absolutely averse to any kind of work except that of the canoe, so that whatever social advancement might be offered to them, they would not accept it. However, in the management of the canoe they are invaluable, for out of the hundreds of times they make the journey of the river, shooting the terrific rapids at lightning speed, besides hauling the canoe and cargo over fallen trees, with which the river is almost impassable, or in the dry season working in the water cutting channels, not 2% of the canoes and freight are actually lost. For 2 days after I arrived at Estacion Santander I was not able to get a canoe going up the river. So to pass the time in so miserable a situation I went alligator hunting. 2 or 3 species of alligator abound in all the swamps and rivers, but the most common is the large cayman, which grows to a length of some 18 to 20 feet and attains an enormous bulk. We had not far to go before we met with several, and this being the breeding season, they were especially hasty-tempered when compared with their usual sluggish disposition. The female scratches a hole in the sand a few yards away from the water's edge. Here she deposits a large number of eggs, from 25 to 70. I have never found them more than 1.5 feet deep, but always on a sandbank considerably elevated above the river to prevent them being washed away with the floods. The months of February and March is the time when the alligators deposit their eggs, and it is extremely dangerous to go near the female when so doing. The huge animal, disturbed on the nest, first gives warning of hostile intentions by uttering a loud hissing sound like a snake, and by puffing out the neck and opening her monstrous jaws. The intruder, who after these warnings disregards them, must be a good shot and armed with a good weapon, or otherwise very careless of his life. Although the natives are careful not to expose themselves too much in the water of the river, many people are annually killed by alligators. If a fisherman advances too far into the water, or some unfortunate Indian upsets his canoe, he very often falls an easy prey to the lurking monsters, which lie at the bottom of the river in perfect shoals, watching for large fish or whatever living being may stray within reach, and once between those terrible teeth all hope must be abandoned, for I have never heard of a single escape. The armour on the back of the alligator is made of a large quantity of stout bone plates under the skin. These are very difficult to penetrate, but the vulnerable parts are the eye and behind the shoulder. A ball well planted in either situation is certain to kill. Our day's sport ended with 2 males and 1 female, all of which the natives managed to drag to the station and skin, only utilizing the skin of the underside of the animal. One of them measured 17 feet and the other 15 feet, fairly good specimens, but not very large. Next day I set about getting together the natives for the canoe, and providing a stock of dried fish, salt beef, cassava root, bananas, and some coffee, together with cooking utensils, fishing nets, guns, and ammunition. It is also necessary to construct an awning over the canoe, to somewhat break the glare of an overpowering sun. The following day, after much delay, I mustered my company of 6 men, and we started up the swift running, muddy stream, not forgetting to take with us a large bottle of native spirit called aguardiente, a liquor made from the sugar cane, of a disgusting taste and unbounded strength, which one would say, in ordinary phraseology, is warranted to kill at 1,000 yards. Indeed, the native boatmen are so accustomed to the use of this drug that the alcohol eventually loses its effect upon them. An amusing instance happened on the journey up the river. I had taken a bottle of alcohol with me to use in a spirit lamp, with the object of boiling water to make tea on the journey. But by some mistake a pint bottle of alcohol was given to the native boatmen instead of the aguardiente. Unfortunately for me, they drank every drop of the fiery substance, with no worse effect than to slightly intoxicate them. I only discovered the mistake when I went to seek the alcohol to make my tea, and found instead only a bottle of native spirit, which would not burn. The boatmen seemed to leave their huts with the utmost reluctance, and proceeded very slowly. In their homes they wear some clothing, and many of them even a decent suit, but once away from the village they discard every vestige of clothing in order to be more ready to jump into the river when pleasure or necessity prompts them. We had not gone far up the river when the natives, struck with a fit of laziness, took to the woods, and left me with 1 man in the canoe to do the best I could. Of course it was impossible for me to proceed without them, so I took my gun and went off into the forest to see if there was anything to shoot. There are plenty of wild pigs, and the tapir, called by the natives la danta, but it is difficult to get a shot at it without having some dogs. I was not long in coming up with some of the natives engaged in fishing in a small lake about 2½ miles from the river. The water muddy and stagnant, but so full of fish that there was no need of the wily patience generally employed in angling. The only difficulty was to get the fish off the hooks quickly enough, so eager were they to bite. In about 2 hours we had taken as many as 4 men could carry. The fish were of 3 kinds, one about 12 inches long, covered with silvery scales, having a very small mouth. This is called by the natives boca chica, or little mouth. It is the fish that most abounds in all parts of Colombia, and is excellent eating, probably a kind of perch. The next is la dorada, or the gilded fish, from 18 to 20 inches in length and 5 inches in girth. The flesh of this is inferior to that of the boca chica, but the appearance is most wonderful. The scales, especially around the head, are of a glistening yellow, making one believe it is wearing a suit of gold gilt armour. The other, a short, ugly fish, with formidable rows of teeth like a miniature shark, is called by the natives manchalo. This fish proved the best food. By the time we had gathered our booty together, the sun, low in the heavens, warned us that it would soon be dark, and we hurried back to the canoe as quickly as possible. The natives gathering wood and making a fire, we all partook of boiled fish, bananas, and a little coffee. After this everyone stretched himself on the sandbank and prepared to wait until morning, amid crowds of hungry mosquitoes. Although the natives dispense with everything, having only the sky for a roof, yet to a European the heavy dews are very injurious, and it is always a good precaution to erect a kind of awning of palm leaves to prevent the clothes being soaked during the night. By daybreak everyone was astir, and the bananas and black coffee were enjoyed with as much gusto as an Englishman would enjoy the proverbial ham and eggs. We were soon moving slowly up the river, the natives working, as usual, without a particle of clothing, in a vertical sun, only now and then stopping to jump into the river to refresh themselves with a bath. On account of the swiftness of the river, it is impossible to use oars, except for crossing, but the labour of pushing the boat along by the sandbank is more tiring, so much so that no European would be able to endure it for more than a few days. In the forenoon I had excellent shooting from amongst a flock of parrots and waterfowl. The banks of the river were alive with the beautiful egret cranes, and the trees full of macaws, some scarlet and blue, some blue and yellow. About midday we partook of our usual rations of fish and bananas, with palm wine. The process of making the palm wine is somewhat curious. The largest of the trees are selected and cut down. Then, when the tree is laid flat, the whole of the leaves which fall uppermost are cut away until the white young growth in the middle of the tree is laid bare. Out of this part a large square piece is cut, sufficient to leave a hollow which will hold at least a quart of water. Then the hollow is carefully covered over, and the palm wine maker waits until next morning. As a rule, when he returns he finds the cavity filled with a whitish liquor, having the appearance and taste of lemonade, only a little sour, but very refreshing and beneficial. About 3 o'clock we arrived at a small station of 2 or 3 huts. Here the natives learned that there was a herd of wild swine in the vicinity, so all progress up the river was stopped, as the boatmen would go no further that day. Everybody was on the alert for a hunt. So all the dogs of the place were got together, and 2 rusty old guns, which were all the station could muster, most of the natives being armed with lances and what is called here the machete, or cutlass. Away we started into the forest, trampling down and cutting through the beautiful strelitzias, delicate palms, and gorgeous creepers. With the help of the dogs we were not long in finding the track of the herd, and then we went on about an hour before we came up with them. The natives wore next to no clothing, but mine was reduced to shreds in the desperate struggle with the thorns and creepers. The first sign of the herd was given to us by a pattering sound and a very rank smell, besides the barking of dogs. Presently we appeared to have dropped into the middle of them, as every part of the forest seemed alive with wild pigs. There must have been at least 300, rushing backwards and forwards in the wildest confusion, some of the natives darting through amongst the trees with the dogs, trying to keep the herd together, others firing as quickly as they could reload their guns, and some using their cutlasses to kill as many as possible. After about a quarter of an hour of the most exciting fight that it is possible to imagine, the whole of the herd that remained unwounded had disappeared, leaving us to dispatch the wounded and gather up the dead. When we were able to collect them together we found 7 as the proceeds of the raid. These were shouldered and carried in triumph to the camp. The cooking process was not a long one. The flesh of the young peccary is excellent, but that of the older ones is somewhat inferior. The largest weigh from 30 to 40 pounds, and are very much like small domesticated pigs, of a dull black colour and having coarse bristles. The head and nose are very long in proportion to the body, and the feet very small. Herds of young peccaries abound in these forests, in such large quantities that the natives can always have fresh meat when they are not too lazy to hunt. It being already dark when we returned to the camp, I contented myself here for the night, and we started by daylight next morning, without any breakfast, as the natives would not wait. So, as a passenger has absolutely no authority over them, I thought it best to let them go when they were in the humour. We took with us a good supply of the flesh of the peccaries, and later, when the boatmen felt inclined, we stopped at a sandbank, and while one party lighted a fire and prepared breakfast, the others went in search of turtles' eggs. The nest of the turtles are discovered in a very curious manner. To an ordinary observer nothing is to be seen but an expanse of flat sand, but the men returned with over 200 eggs, the means of discovering them being to pierce the sand at intervals with a stout stick to find the cavity containing the eggs. The turtle comes out of the river during the night and scratches a deep hole in the sand. In these holes the eggs are deposited all in one night, and not, as is generally supposed, in several nights. I have read accounts of more than 100 eggs being laid by one turtle, but I am not inclined to believe the story, as the oldest native told me he had never found more than 3 dozen in a nest of one turtle. It often happens, however, that 2 or 3 deposit their eggs so close together that they are easily mistaken for one nest. About midday we arrived at a small village called Papayal, a canoe station of little importance. Here I bought some provisions and stayed about an hour. When I was ready to start again I found it almost impossible to persuade the natives to proceed with the canoe. After very much trouble I got them on board, and we continued lazily up the river. That night we camped on a sandbank, the opposite side of the river being the edge of a thick forest. The boatmen lighted a fire and partook of supper, and then, probably fatigued with the toil of the day and the unbearable heat, they were soon stretched on the sand, sleeping heavily. I was unable to sleep on account of the mosquitoes, so I sat down to contemplate the grandeur of the situation. The full moon lighted up the dense forest with a kind of weird, unnatural beauty, and a stillness reigned around that would make one believe we had camped on the territory of the dead. Towards midnight what appeared before so deserted became suddenly animated. Large flights of white cranes arrived and poised themselves on the branches nearest the river, while as many more of the tall grey ones took up quarters on the edge of the sandbank, wading as far as their long legs would allow. The alligators, which up to the present had kept carefully under the water, began to make an appearance, first poking their heads cautiously out, then dragging their long bodies out on the sand, while a crowd of about a dozen turtles raced out of the water. The opposite bank was not less animated than the one on which our canoe was moored. I could hear the peccaries grunting and rushing about in search of food. Several deer and one tapir came down to the water to drink, being distinctly visible in the clear moonlight. The occasional sharp bark of the ocelot and the deep growl of the jaguar, together with the mimic roar of the howler monkey and the low prolonged wailing of the sloth, seemed fit accompaniment for so wild a place. I lay down to rest, leaving them in the height of activity, and when daylight came nothing was to be seen of my midnight visitors but footprints. All this day we kept on steadily up the swift running stream, little of importance taking place, and in the evening we camped again on a sandbank. From here we could see the long blue line of the tops of the Andes away on the horizon, but still at a considerable distance, on account of the winding of the river. End of Chapter 7. Recording by Arnold Banner, Thurmond, North Carolina.